She was a high school dropout that went on to earn 5 degrees and become a highly accomplished university professor. Welcome to Freedom Alive. The prestigious Ivy League schools were established by Christians for the sake of advancing the gospel and training students in sound biblical doctrine. But these schools have lost their way and embraced woke ideologies, and that has infiltrated government schools as well. Dr. Carol Swain is a retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. Before that, she was a professor of politics and public policy at Princeton University. She's experienced firsthand the persecution that now exists for Christians in higher education. Dr. Swain joins us on this program because she is a powerful voice for change in today's social and political climate. I'm blessed to again be joined by Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, Harvard is the oldest of the Ivy League schools, established in 1636. And that Christian foundation and purpose is etched in its walls as well as in the rules and precepts. But this school is one example of what's happening in higher education. And that is, in turn, feeding the woke agenda into our culture.
Yes, it's a credible history of our Ivy League schools, and many of our schools, they all started as Christian schools and universities, and many of them have Christian mottos and symbols and words that remain part of their imagery and their symbols and emblems for the schools. But what's happened is over time, these schools that were created for expanding the gospel and teaching people how to read the Bible and read in foreign languages, they've become taken over with woke ideology. And it first became secularized, and then now we have this DEI, this diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have the LGBTQ. And now, of course, on college and university campuses, we see this anti-Semitism that's taking place. And all of that is because they have displaced as the foundation the idea that we are created in the image of God. And when you displace that as a foundation, you have all these other consequences that take place. So Carol Swain, Dr. Swain, she's lived in that particular world, and she's going to share with us some of the things that she's experienced personally as a professor, as a Black African woman professor in an Ivy League school, and then also what's taking place in the schools today.
A true, inspiring story. We cannot wait to bring it to you, but our Freedom Alert is next. And a reminder that our Freedom Alert is brought to you by Liberty Counsel.
Catholic charter school case left SCOTUS divided. The U.S. Supreme Court recently had the chance to expand education choice to faith-based charter schools, but the High Court deadlocked in a tie vote. That means the opinion of the Oklahoma Supreme Court stands, which allowed the state to exclude a Catholic public charter school from receiving public education funds. Liberty Counsel filed an amicus brief on behalf of Covenant Journey Academy, an online K-12 Christian school. In the brief, Liberty Counsel stated that SCOTUS has long recognized that parents bear the primary responsibility for directing their children's education, a fundamental right that must necessarily include the ability to choose a school that aligns with their values and meets their children's needs. School choice strengthens education. Please pray that another similar case will go to the High Court.
Up next, Matt's interview with Dr. Carol Swain.
I'm pleased to welcome a very special guest, Dr. Carol Swain. She has a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has an incredible, stellar academic background, but it wasn't always that way. So I want to begin, Dr. Swain, thank you first of all for joining us on Freedom Alive with your background, because it gives a background and a foundation for what you have become as a professor, as an author, as an intellectual, and what we're facing today with DEI and some of the other LGBTQ agendas. So thank you for sharing with us. Tell us about how your journey began in high school, because I understand you actually dropped out of high school.
Well, depending on how you count, I'm not sure I actually attended high school. I completed the 8th grade, dropped out in the 9th, and I think that's probably junior high. And then I later got a high school equivalency. And a lot of the studying for the high school equivalency was me and a book. And there was something in Roanoke, Virginia, where you could pick up lessons and call in and get help on the telephone. And so that's what I did. And my scores were really high. In some areas, 98th percentile, but math, it was the 34th percentile. And if it had been 32, I would have failed my GED. And I was told it was some of the highest scores they had ever seen, but I barely passed the math part.
So how did you get from that? Why did you drop out from school? And then how did you get from there to where you are? You have 5 degrees of higher education and a PhD.
And I have something to share. I'm thinking that if I can make some changes in my life, I may actually get a degree in apologetics or something
so you're
related
not done
to
yet.
theology. I might not be. But I dropped out of school because of the poverty. There were times when, I mean, we lived in a 2-room shack during the early part of my life, but not all 12 kids lived there at the same time. But it was the poverty that made it difficult to go to school. There were times in the winter when it snowed a lot that we stayed home until the snow melted. And there was one year that all the children missed around 80 of 180 school days. We all failed. And in preparation for my memoir, I started looking at my academic past, and I realized that I failed twice in elementary school. But I was always smart when I was there. And I can remember being out of school, going to school, and making an A or B on a test. And seared in my memory is an experience where I had been out for a while. The teacher cracked one of those teacher jokes that I hated. "Oh, look, we have a visitor today." And so this little boy started laughing, and she said, "What are you laughing at? She knows more than you do, and you're here every day."
So it wasn't because of lack of intellect. You just didn't have the opportunity. And you could have been a completely different story, but God wrote a different one. And so you then eventually went on. You obviously got your GED. You went into college. You excelled in college. You got master's degrees. You got a Master of Legal Studies from Yale Law School. You have a PhD. You have 5 degrees. And then you began teaching at Ivy League schools, Princeton and Vanderbilt. Tell us about those experiences after you got your degrees of higher education.
First, I want people to know that my story is such a God story that I would never have ever chosen academia for myself. I wanted to be a store manager, so my first degree was in business, and I thought I was going to manage a store at the mall, and people were put in my life who steered me. And when I applied to graduate school, it was because I couldn't get the job I wanted. It wasn't because I had this burning desire, and I was always shy, and I didn't get over my shyness until I was in my 40s. But I always had confidence in my intellect. I graduated magna cum laude from Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia, while working 40 hours a week, nights and weekends at Virginia Western Community College. And while I was at Roanoke College, I got on a list of schools, I guess, that were looking for talented minorities. And I think this is part of this DEI affirmative action story. I grew up, I was born in 1954. I watched the civil rights movement on TV. So I was 10 years old when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And what came out of that was a search for talented minorities, a lot of outreach and a lot of talk about equal opportunity. And it opened doors for people like me. But with my family background, being a professor would have been the last thing. And I can tell you that at Roanoke College, I was on the list because of my academics, and I decided that I didn't want a criminal justice career. That was my degree, criminal justice. I went to Virginia Tech, and while I was there, I started working with a professor, started giving conference papers, And he was encouraging me to become a professor, that there was this critical shortage. I had no interest in filling the critical shortage. I just wanted a job. I had 2 children in a bad marriage. And when I couldn't get a job that I wanted, and this was the 80s, a recession taking place, I applied to graduate school and ended up at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, working with professors again. And by the time I graduated with my degree, in 4 years, I did the PhD, I did my master's in 1 year. I was known across the country.
Well, your story is one of encouragement, because there's so many people that, you know, they don't have everything on a silver spoon, and maybe it's poverty, maybe it's just different situations in their life, but you continue to press forward. And then eventually you became a professor on the college level at Princeton and then also at Vanderbilt. Tell us about those experiences, because some of those experiences shaped some of the thoughts that you have today.
Yes, I can tell you that Princeton pursued me the way I wanted to be pursued. I had a short list of schools. I was a hot shot. I was just known as this talented person. And I had so many job interviews when I first got on the job market that I withdrew so I could finish my dissertation, because I tested the waters. Well, the Princeton professors stayed in touch with me, and I ended up getting a signing bonus and started my career there. They never once oohed and awed about the fact that I was a Black woman. And I always wanted not to be the affirmative action baby. I wanted to be selected on merit. And John DiIulio, you probably know him. He was my colleague at the time. He chaired my search committee. He said that they had looked at hundreds of applications and I was the best qualified. And I believed that. And I liked the fact that they weren't telling me that they were hiring me because I was a minority. In fact, the people that loved me at Princeton the most were the conservatives. But I went in with so much self-confidence. And if I think about me today as an older person being realistic, I don't know where it came from, but I knew I was going to get early tenure. And my goal was to do it in 3 years. And I went through a period in my life when it's almost like if I could think it, it was going to happen. And so I went up in my 3rd year, got tenure in my 4th year. And normally, you know, it's a 7-year process with most people not getting tenure in the Ivy League. Never occurred to me that I wouldn't get it. But after I got the tenure, I became interested in affirmative action. If you remember the mid-1990s, that was when we were having affirmative action debates. Yeah. And I favored class-based affirmative action. And then I saw that people that loved me, all of a sudden, the elites wanted to continue doing what they were doing. They did not want someone Black or someone like me questioning what they were doing. And so the atmosphere started changing. And so the tenure and the prizes that should have made me happy did not make me happy. It set in motion a series of events that led to my leaving, but also my Christian conversion experience. I was not a Christian practicer. I was more one God, many paths, New Age. But I came to faith during those waning years before I took the position at Vanderbilt.
And did you change political parties before or after you became a Christian?
It took me a while.
It took you a while to work through that. But so the interesting thing, Dr. Swain, is because you're an African-American woman, you're a Black woman, they wanted you to think in a certain way. And if you didn't think in the way that they thought you were going to think, then you're betraying the Black race. That seems to be a wrong-headed thinking from the beginning, that you have to think in this way. You can't have this independent thought.
I had no value, and it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans too. I had no value to the university if I was not interested in African-American studies, which I wasn't. I was a professor of politics and with a joint position in the Woodrow Wilson School. So I did public policy. I turned down an offer from the prestigious African-American Studies program because I was always interested in public policy. But what I found was that universities, now this was not Princeton. At that time, the president and people treated me really well. They let me be me. But what I found later was that at universities, if you're a minority and if you don't want to be a part of women's studies, you don't want to be a part of Black studies or African American studies, you have literally no value because the people in those departments are the ones that put value on you. And I find sometimes even among Republicans, I think that they they say that they don't like DEI and affirmative action, but a lot of what they do suggests otherwise.
So now you get over to Vanderbilt and you're teaching there, and that's where you and I met when I was Dean of Liberty University School of Law, when you were a professor at Vanderbilt University. What are you teaching there, and what was your experience like?
I mean, I've taught a variety of courses when I had a joint appointment with the law school. And so I started off in the law school teaching courses on voting rights because that's and representation. That's what my research was about. And then later, you know, I did affirmative action. By the time I was leaving, I was doing religious liberty and a course in political science on the impact of communism on American political thought. And that was like the course that I taught the most right before I left academia. It had waiting lists, and it wasn't conservative students. It was students that just wanted to be in a classroom where they could speak freely and we could debate issues they cared about. And but at Vanderbilt, I started off, you know, being a professor and well received. But as I grew in my faith, I became more and more conservative. And so I went from when on the issue of abortion, I sort of felt like, you know, well, if a woman chooses abortion, she's the one that stands before God. She has to give her own account. That's none of my business. But I ended up, during the time that I was there, shifting on that position, sharing my own abortion story that had been hidden for years. And I went from being an independent to, in 2009, I became a Republican. But this was after George Bush had appointed me to two appointments. And one was renewed by President Obama. I was appointed to the National Endowment to the Humanities and the Tennessee Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission by Bush, and then later that was renewed by Obama. And as you know, President Trump appointed me to the 1776 Commission as vice chair. So I've had political appointments from Bush, Obama, and Trump.
And so while you're there, though, you're now starting in your thinking politically and otherwise, your worldview thinking, to become more conservative as you grow in your faith. What happens now with you in the school and the student body as you obviously are starting to shift in your political and worldview views? Well,
it became more pronounced after President Obama was elected. In 2009, I wrote a book, Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise. And I started doing more media where I was critical of the Obama administration. That made a lot of my colleagues upset because they said, well, you didn't criticize Bush. Now, that wasn't true because I'd written op-eds, I'd criticized Bush as well. I saw myself as an independent. But so I started getting colleagues that were unhappy. But as I grew in my faith, I started advising Christian groups on campus. So the first scandal I had, or first confrontation with the university, was a policy they adopted in 2012 that ended up resulting in, by 2013, about half of the Christian groups losing their student recognition. And we fought that tooth and nail. But I was the faculty face of that fight. And then we lost. The students graduated. And so that was a bitter pill for the university that I was there and I had not been on board. And then in 2015, I wrote an opinion piece criticizing Islam, and it was published in the Tennessean. This was after the Charlie Hebdo attack where the cartoonists were killed in Paris. That created a firestorm, something I never anticipated. And I had always, all of my career, I was known as a provocative thinker. All of a sudden, I saw a reaction that I had never encountered before. There was a lot of support, and it sort of boosted me. It gave me national recognition at a level that, so that there were people that supported me, I was told the Times Square Church had my name on the marquee to pray for me. But it ended up with putting in motion a chain of events that led to me making the decision to retire early from academia. And it's not something I saw coming because I'd worked so hard to become a tenured professor, but my whole career collapsed, and it's like I became like kryptonite. And I had to reinvent myself. And so what you see today, when you see the media, you see me doing the various things on social media, and I have small businesses, I had to reinvent myself because I was persona non grata.
Well, in your situation, your story is an incredible story of coming from poverty to getting 5 degrees to going into these Ivy League schools, and then experiencing firsthand this groupthink idea that if you don't think in a certain way that the academia or some segment of society wants you to think, you're persona non gratis. And we've seen this happening in some of the levels of higher education. We see this obviously with Columbia post-October 7, with what's happening there and what they're doing to the Jewish students, with some of the think there. Also Harvard University. How is it that we can begin to change these universities? Because all of these universities, most of them began, all these Ivy League ones began with a Christian foundation. And sure now you experience what you have experienced and what we see. How can we reclaim the universities back to at least a semblance of some kind of real, true commitment to education and higher learning?
I believe that when I started college, that universities were more or less a marketplace of ideas, because I certainly had conservative professors, I had liberal professors, there'd be a few Marxists, but I got exposed to ideas. Universities became indoctrination mills. It started before 2008, but it accelerated during the Obama regime. And I think one of the ways to change them is that people voting with their dollars. If you look at the surveys, a majority of Americans and students don't think a college degree is worth the money. Yeah. I run into very wealthy people who have set aside, trust funds for their children's education, and they're telling me, or their grandkids, that they have given some of these children an option. You can go to college, the one, that they pick, or you can take the money and start a business. But the college universities are in decline. They have become indoctrination mills. I believe they can be turned around, and I believe the battle that President Trump is having with Harvard is brilliant. Yeah. And it's key, because he has to take Harvard was the top dog. If he can make an example of them, and they thought they were above the law, they could do anything they wanted, and so they've been discriminating for decades, and very agenda driven, very much in alliance with foreign governments that were enemies of the United States, and they did not address the anti-Semitism. And the Ivy League, they've been known for years for having anti-Semitism and the biases, and some of the biases were against black students. They had affirmative action, but they preferred the offspring of immigrants to the black descendants of slaves. And they were more interested in pedigree than in people's qualifications. So I think that this example of Harvard will have a ripple effect. And all you need is 1 or 2 major universities that go back to being a marketplace of ideas. They're going to have to diversify their faculties. They're going to have to bring in conservatives, and they're going to have to rethink what they're about. And I think if they were to go back and read their original founding documents and meditate on that, and make the board read it, make the faculty read it, that would be a good first start.
I think you're right, Dr. Swain. I think we are living at a time where there's a tipping point and there's a change, and it's an exciting time to be in with regards to education, K through 12 with school choice, higher education with what we see happening with Donald Trump and what he's doing. Also in Florida, Florida's an example as well. Governor Ron DeSantis has taken on higher education, totally changed the environment in Florida by taking strong leadership and bringing education back to where it should be. To coin a term from President Donald Trump, make education great again. I think that's I think we're living at a time where we can actually see that happening. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Swain.
Thank you.
Your website, people can contact you with your books. You have other books and resources. CarolMSwain.com, CarolMSwain.com. And thank you for your incredible story and for sharing with us on Freedom Alive.
Thank you.
Matt, this story is a remarkable illustration of what we've witnessed, really, at least I can say in my lifetime, maybe yours too, of college and universities and how they've been perceived, right? They have this unassailable, coveted position in so many people's minds, like your kids have to go to college, I have to go to college. And now with what's been happening over decades, really, but certainly in recent years, Carol Swain talks about instances where people have college funds that they've saved their whole lives for their kids to go to college, and now they're looking at it squarely differently and saying, would you like these funds to start a business? I mean, there's a lot going on here.
The younger generation right now is actually questioning the value of college because college has done this to themselves. Yeah. They've inflicted their own mortal wounds with their valueless, I guess, or challenging values, the DEI, the LGBTQ, the other ideologies, Marxism, socialism, other things that happen, the anti-American, sentiment that you see in a lot of these colleges. And what they've done in the faculty, it's become basically a clique, if you will, where they only hire certain people that have the same view that they have. And it's typically a very hostile view to general American values.
You've tackled it head on. Do you want to spend a minute on Covenant Journey Academy, the Liberty Council initiative?
Well, we launched Covenant Journey Academy. It's an online K-12 school available 24/7, 365, self-paced, rolling enrollment, so you can enroll every week, any time of the year, throughout 52 weeks of the year. And in fact, we have nearly 300 course options. So a lot of different options for parents that you can either take all those courses, or you can supplement your homeschool course, or you can supplement your private or your public school options, because I can tell you, there's no public school or private school that has all the different options that we have. 6 foreign languages. You can start, for example, Spanish in kindergarten. So you have a lot of options, and I think that's some of the tip of the iceberg of the changing dynamics in school choice, and that's a good thing.
Amen. Amen. Many new options, many new ideas, many new models. Let's be in prayer about this and make education great again. In closing, remember 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, which says, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong. Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.